Hi everyone, this is Dr. Heather Austin Roblard, and this lecture video is going to be a continuance of the first lecture video of Module 3 in gathering information for a substance abuse evaluation. As we've discussed in previous lecture modules, we will go over the skills, knowledge, and tasks from the ICRC exam and LCDC licensing exam that you will need to know and will be focused on in this lecture module. This video will focus on gathering information and assessing that information to be able to summarize the data for a substance abuse evaluation. We will also focus on substance use disorder assessment instruments and their limitations. You will learn how to select and administer assessment instruments. And again, we will basically be covering remaining information for Domain 1 in the core competencies discussed in Module 2. You have seen this model in previous lecture videos, but we will be focusing on these things: the interviews, behavioral observations, case history and data, psych tests, and other sources of information that we will be collecting before we can interpret and summarize and conclude the results. First, let's talk about interviews. Interviews are a method of gathering information through using direct communication that involves also reciprocal exchange from the client. This can be in any form. It can be a face-to-face interview. You can do it over a video conferencing tool like Zoom, or you can do it over the phone. It can include many forms of people or constellations of individuals. So first, it can be with the client versus the family, or a probation officer, or even a third-party person, like before I've done a business partner. Typically, it's in 3 different formats. It can be a structured interview, a semi-structured interview, or an unstructured interview. There are different pros and cons for each of these types or formats of interviewing. It can be a pro or a con with how standardized the interview is, whether it's objective or subjective. There also can be a con of whether there's error, or maybe it sounds too robotic, so you're not joining with the client and you're not able to build that rapport as much as an unstructured interview could. For example, this is a structured interview. This is one of the recommended reading handouts located in this module reading. It's called the Brief Intake Interview, or the TCU-BI. As you will see, there are several direct questions, and you're following specific domains in order to answer all of those questions. So this is what we would call a structured interview. As the interviewer, you are considered a tool. Just like the audit or the DAST would be considered an assessment tool, the interview is considered a tool. You cannot be completely objective. One, because you're working as an outside person, so you might be working for the city, for the treatment center, so there is inherently some lack of objectivity or bias to you. It's very important as the interview, part of your skills are to develop trust and rapport with the individual at the beginning of the session, so that way the client trusts you enough to be honest and upfront with the information that they share. Remember that the interviewer needs to be informational and not necessarily therapeutic. So we are interviewing them to gather information, not to help them fix their problems. Another form of gathering information is behavioral observation. I think this one tends to get overlooked quite often, but during an interview versus their natural environment or in a controlled environment, there are going to be different behaviors that are presented. For example, if I do an interview in somebody's home, I'm going to see different behavioral observations that I wouldn't see in a jail per se. When you write about this specific domain, here are some possible things you can look for. Unusual mannerisms do they have tics? Are they constantly touching their face or twirling their hair or looking away? Physical appearance, do they come in disheveled or are they very neat and structured? Attention, are they often getting off task or getting distracted by things in their environment? The ease of establishing rapport, are they extremely vague and resistant to you, or are they open and willing to share with you? Their ability to follow instructions and questions, are they answering the questions that you're asking? Are they continuing to go off on tangents and not really focus on the question. And then there's other types of behavioral observation that might just come up that you're not really thinking of and won't be common among all people. So maybe there's some specific observational data that you notice when they're in a family situation, like they keep turning to their partner when you ask them a question to get approval. Those would all be things you'd want to write about in your substance abuse evaluation for this specific domain. Again, the observer is a tool. We are not completely objective or unbiased. We are human beings, so we can't be completely objective. There are certain standardized behavioral observations, but they are not necessarily for substance use disorders, so they won't necessarily be appropriate for using a standardized tool for behavioral observation in a substance abuse evaluation. In most substance abuse evaluations, you will also gather case history data. This is basically archival data from different forms or different sources. For example, if you have a probation officer that is wanting a substance abuse evaluation, you would get data from the probation officer, like their arrest records, their previous treatments. If this is their second attempt at a treatment center, you might get archival data from other treatment centers about their success in that program, aftercare information, drug tests, any of that stuff. There are some pros and cons to this. Any data that is independent from you is not necessarily unbiased. For example, if you get information from a probation officer, obviously they have their own agenda. Or if you get information from a divorce attorney, they have their own agenda. So you have to take everything you get with a grain of salt and not let it completely sway your recommendations, which is why we want to get more information to see a full picture rather than just basing our treatment recommendations on one source of information. Another very common form of gathering information is going to be psychological tests. Psychological tests measure variables like craving, motivation, depression, any of those kinds of things. They can be in a format of paper and pen. It can be a structured interview. It can even be computer assisted, or it can be that structured behavioral observation we discussed. Most of these tend to be more objective than others, and again, is an actual tool and not just the interviewer. When doing a substance evaluation, you don't want to just use the interview as your main gathering information. You also want to have some psychological tests to back up your data and your interpretation of the interview. These psychological tests typically have a score corresponding an interpretation. So they leave it more subjective. So for example, if you score within this range, this means blank. This gives you, again, more evidence to show us why somebody has a specific disorder, as well as why a treatment program can be beneficial, because you have this data to back it up. Psychological tests are often used in screeners and in evaluation of specific programs or progress of their trajectory. Then, of course, there's other sources of information. This is basically any other information that is not previously outlined in, the ones we just discussed, but may not always be available. For example, they could have drug test results, GPS and breathalyzers, smartphones. All of those things can also be used as information. And typically those are used when there's some kind of court case involved. There may be more that we will learn about later in this semester and go more into detail with, so you'll learn more from those future lecture videos. I hope this information kind of gives you a brief overview of what you can expect and how you can gather information for your substance abuse evaluation.